tropical holiday. Think of what made that holiday. Or if it's still on your to-do list, what you would hope for. Perhaps it's the food, the people, or the beaches.
Our tropical holiday was our honeymoon. Beautiful swimming pools and crystal clear beaches. Someone else here might also remember the honeymoon they looked forward to during their busy lead up to their marriage. Dennis and I had a great time in Thailand, 7 days of heaven on earth with the one I love. Sunshine, seafood, amazing $10 massages. And whilst the honeymoon ended, it was the beginning of a happy marriage of 8 years so far.
The 7 days was a great break from my work as a renderer. Pretty physical work on a job site, lifting cement bags and shoveling sand. So just to relax and give my body a rest was great. And despite Sarah's idyllic description of Thailand, my strongest memory of that magnificent beach is something very different. Back to that shortly.
Tangent. I never imagined working in a prison. That wasn't the honeymoon, by the way. But this present career does have a connection to the beach in Thailand that Dennis will get to. When I met him, I was working as a beauty therapist. And I invite you to picture Dennis at the time. Take a look at him now and add about 20 kilos of pure muscle with 5% body fat. Yes, he was a Schwarzenegger. And yes, he was a week away from the Australian Bodybuilding Championships. He walked into the beauty salon where I was working and asked for a spray tan for the competition. So off to the spray booth and I began spraying his body. It could have been love at first sight, but the real spark happened when we chatted. It wasn't his built body that attracted me. I didn't dislike it, no. He looked really good. But he had a personality that was both gentle and strong, and seemed to have a special presence about him. 3 years later, we took the step and married. And since that beach in Thailand, Dennis has influenced the way I look at people in the world. Hence the change of career to my current crazy work. My goodness, a prison. I was a chilled out person who generally let things be. Didn't sweat the small stuff and kept it simple. Despite being married to Dennis, I haven't given up all those traits. He'll tell you I've chilled him out, so I must have kept some of that character. But he's made me much more of a thinker, a strategist, to the point that I can back myself to do things I wouldn't previously have thought of.
Okay, since this is a pretty rare occasion to be up here on stage with so many of you, I'm going to take a selfie. All right, ready? Great. Okay, so let me just retouch my scar and apply a skin smoothing layer over my photo so it's perfect before it goes on social media. Okay, and post. In the social media world, we have the control to change the way we look before people perceive us. But in the real world, it can be challenging to apply layers over things we don't like about ourselves. Do you have something in your life that you wished you could change so people could perceive you differently? True though, we're often not aware of a problem until somebody points it out. At age 6, I became aware of my struggle to say certain words. A boy who sat behind me in kindergarten class made me realise this by thumping his fists on my back as I stuttered. Apart from his bruising massage in my back, that bullying was my first bruising emotional scar, and one that long endured. From that age, I had to quickly think of how to stop stuttering, or at least how to hide it, so as not to be different to others. My self-consciousness even affected my posture. I was so worried that people wouldn't like me, or that I would be judged for speaking differently to others. So to avoid this, I trained myself to become a covert stutterer. Two main tactics I developed and mastered were word substitution and avoiding public speaking situations. For example, approaching the Macca's counter for a quarter pounder, I would instead order a Big Mac. I just couldn't say quarter pounder without mucking it up. I could give you hundreds of examples that I had to work around and remember every day. It was a constant strategy to ward off the compounding impact on my self-esteem. Regarding that other trick of avoiding speaking in public, I just wouldn't show up to social gatherings for fear of stuttering in front of new people. Or on the first day of school, I'd pretend to be sick and save the trauma of standing up in front of the class and introducing myself. If you compare it to someone putting on makeup to hide a scar, my word substitution and avoidance were putting makeup over my sense of shame. But like makeup, the more retouching and applying layers, the more evident it becomes to others that there is something to hide. Have you ever felt this way? I'm sure there are ways many can relate. And so this intense, lonely effort went on constantly to employ the tactics to substitute, avoid, or withdraw. It was never even talked of in my immediate family, as my successful tactics made them think I'd grown out of it. In the process, though, you miss out on so much quality of life because all your energy is dealing with this intense self-consciousness and working on tactics. Okay, so in 2010, getting back to that beach in Thailand, the day after getting married, 30 years old, it might just sound like a few words, but I'd never said them to anyone. Words about a daily reality that had controlled so much of my focus. I gathered the courage to disclose to my beautiful wife, Sarah, that I have a stutter. Feeling lucky for the water to splash in my eyes to hide my tears, the chilled out Sarah just said, "Really? I didn't even know." Her "didn't know" response says something about the energy used to cover this thing up that had consumed me. I had to say that I've had a lot of resentment about not disclosing sooner. Not just to Sarah, but to others. I could have done so much in my life that I haven't because of avoidance. But in fact, dealing with that resentment is one of the key ways I've discovered a very realistic and relevant faith, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. And dealing with that resentment also now gives me a lot of empathy for people with all sorts of conditions, people who continue to have to miss out. So there's a window into why I'd have said you were mad if you'd have told me 10 years ago that I would now be a photographer, running a business, dealing with people every day, and having constant, spontaneous public communication. Just the thought of that would have been traumatic.
When I think back, it does seem crazy that I never knew this about Dennis until that honeymoon moment swimming in the crystal clear beach in Thailand. Sure, there'd been a bit of a delay in his voice, but so what? We all sound a bit different. I didn't care about that. But if he told me earlier that his stutter problem, I probably would have just said, so what? Worry about real problems, and no doubt that wouldn't have helped. It's only since that first disclosure that I've grown to appreciate just how this stutter gripped Dennis and demanded so much lonely energy every day of his life. And it's only since then that I've become to know how much, from the time that kindergarten kid used to tap his back and imitate him, that his esteem was marked with shame, with an inability to back himself, with intense survival tactics, and with missed opportunities and withdrawal. I find it quite ironic that I used to apply layer upon layer of makeup on so many clients as a beauty therapist, and on myself too, and never really thought how, in some ways, the scars that I covered up for people may have been their tactic to hide behind, covering a deeper feeling in their lives than what was obvious.
So after I shared my secret struggle with Sarah in 2010, I attended a treatment program for stutterers. And I recognise now that I could do that largely because I'd trusted someone with his perceived weakness. And she had deeply accepted me. Day after day of learning new speaking and breathing techniques, I was able to get back into normal life, and I felt like Superman. But after a few months, I started falling back to using my old tactics. Sure, I had the new skills, but maintaining the progress was difficult. I kept getting overwhelmed by a long background of shame and poor esteem. But for me, there was an eye-opening alignment with faith that made the difference. Why I had not made the connection as much previously is beyond me. But the words of St. Paul screamed out at me one day at church with new meaning. Apparently St. Paul, that very capable leader, had some deep burden in his life. He called it a thorn in his side, and whatever it was, he prayed and he prayed to be spared of it. The response from God that he sensed was, "My grace is enough for you. My power is at its best in weakness." It seems St. Paul was not spared of it, but instead gave it over to be used, and he went on and became the phenomenal missionary who we still hold up 2,000 years later. Why did I hear these words of St. Paul so loudly? Was it that those words could be true for me too? The rest of that brief piece from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians has some words that are like gold to me. After that line about God's power being best in weakness, Paul says, "So I shall be very happy to make my weakness my special boast, so that the power of Christ may stay over me. For it is when I am weak that I am strong." My new skills learned in the treatment program, along with the accompaniment of my life partner Sarah, now had a further power behind them. It was a dramatically new understanding of the availability of God's presence for our lives. and it has transformed my sense of myself in a way I never expected or imagined. The Jesus who, after rising from death, kept saying, "Do not be afraid," has become more present to me than ever before. I consider myself an ordinary person and don't make any super holy religious claims. But I am enormously thankful that as a consequence of the particular struggles that gripped me, I can now say that faith means a lot more to me than just knowing a bunch of words about Jesus. Instead, I have a strong sense of knowing him in my daily life. I continue a practice of breathing his presence and promise into my daily life and struggles, and continue to develop this sense of knowing rather than knowing about Jesus. I'm also quite sure that the lighter side of Sarah's personality has influenced this. I'm much more conscious now than earlier in my life that faith is meant to be a strength and joy, a daily liberator, and with plenty of room for a bit of the chilling out that Sarah has brought to our relationship.
You could say that we've learned that faith gives the chilling out a different quality. I admit that a lot of my don't worry attitude was also about not wanting to worry about things, probably a bit of an avoidance. But the enriched faith that Dennis and I have come to share is making a difference in our lives in some particular ways. First, it's helping us let go of certain things that don't really matter because we see more realistically that we're part of a bigger picture. Second, it's helping us let go of other things by intentionally giving them to God. Saying to God, for example, that we've done our best with something and we now give that energy into God's hands to bless whatever happens. And thirdly, are the things we do keep worrying about that are worth worrying about. Our kids, our relationship, our purpose, our work goals, our contribution to making a difference. By consciously inviting God's companionship into these things, we strive to invite a grace of trust and to release anxiety. Well, there's no time tonight to talk about photographic businesses or serving in prison work, but as we still feel very surprised that we've stepped up in these unexpected ways, it gives us a growing trust in our shared faith for what the next chapter ahead can bring. In a nutshell, we're really hearing those words, "Do not be afraid." May each of you, in your own stories, hear them too.